1920. Of course, we are realizing after in 1920, after World War I. So we are saying the League of Nations was established by the Treaty of Versailles of 1919 and became functional at the start of 1920. The League had the Secretariat, the Council, the Assembly, and the Permanent Court of Justice as its organs. And it was formed to promote international relations, check aggression, and promote peace. You remember that it was a question of failure to have an international body that led to World War I. That's why the diplomats came up with the idea of the League of what? Nations. It was the idea of big names, big brands in politics, like Woodrow Wilson. Of course, when he presented the 14 points program to big names, like Keremenchu said, Woodrow Wilson speaks like Jesus Christ of Nazareth. If the Almighty God gave us 10 laws and we turn against them, Woodrow Wilson has given us 14, we shall say. In others, they were not willing to honor, but they picked in a very important point of the formation of the League of what? Nations. But then we need to know the key reason that led to the failure of the League of Nations. So we are saying the League of Nations lacked a standby armed force to enforce its resolutions. The League had great resolutions, but it lacked a standby armed force to enforce its resolutions. The hard question is, how were the resolutions going to be enforced when the League of Nations was lacking a standby armed force to enforce its resolutions? That's why later stubborn men took political power. And by this time, they could not be stopped by the League of Nations. So we are saying the League of Nations was formed by the unpopular and unrealistic Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. The diplomats at Versailles came up with the idea of forming the League of Nations. So since the Versailles Peace Treaty was unpopular, some people are not willing to honor and go ahead with the League of what? Nations. That's why some members withdrew. So we are saying the fact that the League of Nations was formed by the unpopular and unrealistic Versailles Peace Treaty, this explains why it had to fail. Then we are saying the dual domination of the League by the selfish states, Britain and France. We are saying today, selfish states, Britain and France dominated the League of Nations. It is this that made some other countries to rise up against the League of what? Nations. Because they were claiming that the League was dominated by Britain and France. So it is this that led to its failure, because it made some countries to rise up against the League of Nations. Then the withdrawal of membership by several states, for example, Germany, Italy, and Japan. Many states withdrew from the League of Nations. As they withdrew, this weakened the League of Nations. This explains why finally it had to fail. So you need to understand the key reasons that led to the failure of the League of Nations. Another one, the ideological differences between the members of the League. We are realizing members of the League of Nations had differences in ideology. Later we had big ideologies like communism and capitalism. But at one time, some had elements of democracy, others had elements of dictatorship. The hard question is, how was the League of Nations going to survive when members had differences in terms of ideology? So the differences in ideology explains the failure of the League of Nations. Then we are saying the rise of aggressive dictators such as Benito Mussolini in Italy, 1922. As aggressive dictators took political power, these ones, their mission was not only to control their countries, but they wanted to control the whole of Europe and possibly the whole world. So it is this that led to the failure of the League of Nations, because the aggressive leaders had to turn against the League of what? Nations. And this even influenced smaller states to rise up against the League of Nations. Then the adoption of the appeasement policy. Appeasement policy was advanced by a man called Chamberlain after realizing that Italy and Germany were so much humiliated. He wanted to appease Hitler and Mussolini. Whatever was asked by Hitler and Mussolini could be given to him. But the problem was one. Hitler and Mussolini used the appeasement policy to believe that powers were here and there. And they started attacking countries. For example, Austria was attacked, Czechoslovakia, and later Poland. So it was the appeasement policy which was designed by Chamberlain to stop the Second World War, to appease Hitler and Mussolini. Instead, the policy made them to feel confident. And they had to rise up against the League of what? Nations. So we are saying it is this that explains the failure of the League of Nations. Another one, the revival of the system of alliances. Later, there was the revival of the system of alliances where Hitler and Mussolini had to form Berlin-Rome-Tokyo axis, and this made Britain to form Allied powers camp. It is this that made the powers to challenge one another, and by this time, it is this that explains the failure of the League of Nations, because the League was against the alliances, the formation of what? Alliances. But when the alliances were revived, it is this that explains the failure of the League of Nations. Another one, the financial constraints of the League of Nations. The League, as a great organization, it needed a great economic muscle, which economic muscle was supposed to be used to organize meetings. The economic muscle had to be used to crush all of those rising up against the League of what? Nations. But we are saying by this time the financial constraints of the League of Nations explains the failure of the League of what? Nations. Then the weak administrative setup of the League of Nations. The administrative setup of the League was full of weakness. For example, they could sit just anyhow without proper procedure. The other question is, how was the League of Nations going to survive when by this time they had a weak administrative setup? Then the limited capacity to enforce sanctions. We are saying today, the League had a limited capacity to enforce sanctions. Sanctions, they could refuse countries, let's say, to trade with a certain one country, let's say Germany. But countries continue to trade with that particular one country. It is this that made even smaller states to rise up against the League of Nations. So we are saying, this explains why the League of Nations had to fail. I can tell you, it was meant to survive, but finally it had to do what? To fail. Because